Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a massive 1,000-year leap through history to uncover exactly how the medieval era forged the modern world. We're going to dig into the sweeping story of not just one, but two distinct civilizations whose parallel journeys essentially shaped the borders, beliefs, and power dynamics that we literally still live with today.
You know, when we think of the Middle Ages, it's so easy to just picture European knights in shining armor and big stone castles. But in reality, it was a dynamic 1,000-year seesaw of power between a fragmenting Europe and the explosive, magnificent rise of the Islamic world.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be covering the fall and the rise, moving through the Dark and Golden Ages, looking at colliding worlds and crusades, tackling the catastrophes that changed everything, and finally, reaching the dawn of modernity. Let's jump right in.
Part 1. The Fall and the Rise, covering the 500s through the 700s.
Just to anchor ourselves before we get into the weeds, we're looking at a huge sweep of time here, from 500 to 1500 CE. These are the absolute crucial macro events we are going to unpack, starting right at Rome's collapse and going all the way up to the dawn of sovereign states.
Right off the bat, we've got this massive juxtaposition. By 476 CE, the Western Roman Empire completely collapses. Its grand infrastructure decays, literacy plummets, and political power just fractures into localized Germanic kingdoms. The West essentially becomes rural and, well, impoverished. But meanwhile, over in the East, by the 630s, it's a totally different story. You have this remarkably swift consolidation. A brand new monotheistic faith, Islam, unites the Arab tribes under the Prophet Muhammad, and it sets off an explosive territorial expansion.
So, how was this massive new Islamic state actually governed? Well, after Muhammad's death, leadership passed to his successors, known as caliphs. And these caliphs were incredibly successful at centralizing religious, political, and military power all in one place. That kind of unity enabled lightning-fast conquests. They completely overwhelmed the neighboring Christian Byzantine and Persian Sasanian empires, carving out an immense caliphate that stretched all the way from Iran to North Africa.
Moving into Part 2. Dark Ages and Golden Ages, spanning the 800s to the 1000s.
All right, back in Europe, things are looking pretty grim. They are under constant, terrifying siege from Vikings roaming the coasts, Magyars from the east, and pirates down south. Kings are basically losing their grip on centralized power. So local warrior nobles step in, ruling from these dense networks of wooden castles. They offer protection and land to lesser lords and peasants in exchange for military service and intense loyalty. And boom! That's the birth of feudalism, a whole system held together entirely by personal relationships and localized coercive force.
The contrast during this time is just wild. While European survival becomes hyper-localized, and the great unified dream of the Carolingian Empire completely shatters, the Islamic world is entering its absolute zenith. The Abbasid dynasty moved their capital to Baghdad, turning it into the largest, most prosperous city in the world. We're talking a massive, multicultural golden age. They're patronizing physicians, philosophers, and astronomers, actively preserving and translating ancient Greek texts, all while Europe is largely just struggling to feed itself.
Actually, here's a quick, totally surprising detail for you. These two radically different worlds weren't totally cut off from each other. The incredibly wealthy Abbasid caliph, Harun al-Rashid, actually kept up diplomatic relations with Charlemagne over in Europe. He even sent Charlemagne a literal elephant as a gift, which, as you can imagine, caused absolute massive excitement back in the Frankish kingdom. I mean, imagine seeing an elephant in medieval Europe.
But it's important to note it wasn't all perfect. The Islamic world was wrestling with its own deep internal tensions. What originally started as a political dispute over who was the rightful successor to Muhammad, basically his descendants versus elected leaders, gradually hardened into the Sunni and Shia split. And that fundamental religious rift would eventually splinter their political power, with rival Shia and Sunni dynasties fighting for dominance across the Middle East and North Africa.
Which brings us to Part 3, Colliding Worlds and Crusades, the 1000s to the 1200s. So as we cross the millennium mark into the year 1000, something crazy happens. The global temperature actually changes. Fueled by a warming climate, Europe experiences this incredible agricultural revolution. They start producing way more food, which triggers a massive population boom. Europe effectively wakes up from its localized slumber. Forests are cleared, bustling trade networks pop up, and a brand new merchant class is born. On top of that, the Catholic Church completely restructures itself into a robust, centralized papal monarchy. Suddenly, Europe is organized, confident, and expanding.
And this sets the stage for a fascinating, violent collision. You have this newly unified, aggressive European force pushing outward. By 1095, Pope Urban II actually channels that new aggression into launching the Crusades. But where are they marching? Directly into a Middle East that is culturally brilliant, but deeply, deeply divided politically. Baghdad is now controlled by Turkic Seljuks, and the wider region is totally fractured between competing Shia and Sunni powers. It leaves them incredibly vulnerable to this sudden Western incursion.
Now, the European Crusaders did successfully establish states on the Mediterranean coast for a while, but eventually the divided Middle East found a unifier. A highly charismatic Sunni leader named Saladin managed to bring the fractured Muslim forces together. In 1187, he decisively defeated the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin and took back Jerusalem. It was a massive, massive blow to the Western outposts.
Next up is Part 4, Catastrophes that Changed Everything, the 1200s to the 1300s.
1258. Mark that year down because it is truly catastrophic. That is the year the seemingly invincible Mongol Empire swept out of the Asian steppes and absolutely sacked Baghdad. They executed the Abbasid Caliph, literally rolled him in a carpet and trampled him with horses, and they burned the legendary House of Wisdom to the ground. This brutal, horrific event effectively and definitively ended the Islamic Golden Age.
But somehow, amazingly, out of the ashes of that sheer destruction rose the Mamluks of Egypt. Now, the Mamluks were an elite warrior class made up of former slave soldiers, and in 1260, they pulled off an unprecedented military feat. They actually defeated the Mongol horde at Ain Jalut. They halted the Mongol advance dead in its tracks, cementing themselves as the fierce new defenders of Islam.
Meanwhile, Europe is facing its own absolute apocalypse. In 1347, the global plague we know as the Black Death hits the continent's shores. And it was a demographic disaster on a scale that's almost hard to even comprehend today. Within just a few short years, this horrifying plague wiped out roughly 1/3 of Europe's entire population. Think about that. Entire towns and settlements just vanished from the map.
However, and this is absolutely crucial to understanding European history, that horrific demographic disaster is exactly what broke the feudal system. Because the population dropped so drastically, there was suddenly a desperate, massive demand for labor. That meant the surviving peasants and workers suddenly had real bargaining power. They demanded better conditions, they demanded higher wages, and they got unprecedented freedoms. The rigid feudal hierarchy was fractured forever.
Which brings us to our final act, Part 5, the dawn of modernity, the 1400s to the 1500s.
The real catalyst for this entire new era, it was technological. The gunpowder revolution completely flipped the script on warfare across the globe. Suddenly, a simple infantryman with a firearm could take down the most heavily armored, highly trained knight. Cannons could effortlessly blast right through those thick feudal stone walls. War became so insanely expensive that only powerful, centralized kings could afford these new standing armies. The old warrior nobles, they lost their military edge entirely and had to become administrators and courtiers.
So by 1500 CE, we see Western Europe organizing into these emerging sovereign nation-states, places like France, Spain, and England. And they're starting to look outward, getting ready to cross the Atlantic. And directly mirroring them over in the east, you have these massive, highly centralized Islamic gunpowder empires, the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires, dominating the Middle East and Asia.
So as we wrap up this explainer, looking at these two massive spheres of influence, now armed with gunpowder and consolidated power, we really have to ask ourselves, how much of our modern world today, our nation-states, our global trade routes, our maps, and our deep-seated geopolitical divides, how much of that is simply the lasting echo of this magnificent, thousand-year seesaw of civilizations? It is definitely something to think about the next time you look at a map of the world. Thanks for exploring this with me today.